Pam, and thank you. That was a true honor, and honestly, it came out of the blue to the point where when I got the email, it did not come from Upstate Forever, the organization that I've been active in for many, many years. It came from a public relations firm. This is my wife, Jane, sitting right here. And I wouldn't open it because I thought it was, like some Algerian prince. If you send me $500, we could split it and make $1 million. And so I sent it to Jane, and she said, I don't know, this looks pretty suspicious. Well, anyway, after a couple of days, I finally opened it. It said, you have been awarded the so-and-so. And then I was sure it was bogus. I said, there was no way. Anyway, it was a great honor. And I appreciate the introduction. I'm going to make you a promise that I rarely do. In the next hour, you are going to see things you've never seen before, and you're going to learn some things you didn't know when you came through the door. I do a lot of slideshows, probably a dozen, from wildflowers to a number of different things. But this is a compelling story. This is really about the discovery of rock art, which includes both pictographs, cave paintings, and petroglyphs, cave rock carvings, around 1999, right before the turn of the millennium. I'll tell you a short story which prefaces the rest of the slideshow. I had a cold call, which I get when you write for the Wildlife magazine, which is kind of an institution in South Carolina. People call you with all sorts of things. How do I get a possum out of my attic? And what's this bear scat that I found on the side of the trail, and this kind of stuff. And this fellow calls and says he's an archaeologist with the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, and he's looking for petroglyphs. And I'm thinking, look, I don't know a whole lot about this kind of thing, but the petroglyphs are out in New Mexico and Arizona. What we have around here is arrowheads, and occasionally we'll find a piece of pottery. That's it. Well, I listened to him for a few minutes, and I said, well, let me ask you something. I said, how long have you been an archaeologist? He said, 25 years. I said, well, how many of these petroglyphs have you seen in South Carolina? And he said, 6. I said, really? Where are they? And he said, well, my office is on Pendleton Street in Columbia. If you know where the Capitol building is, that's Pendleton, right behind the Capitol. And he says, there's a boulder between here and the Congaree River, which is not all that far away. And he said, there's a meticulously carved beetle about a foot across on that boulder. I said, seriously? And I said, where else? He said, well, there's a turtle carved on a rock up on Chattooga River. So now he's got my attention. And so I said, well, how can I help you? He said, well, the reason I'm contacting you is, he said, they say at the Wildlife magazine, you know your way around up in the mountains. And he said, they're finding these things in eastern Tennessee, western Virginia, northwestern North Carolina, and northeastern Georgia, and they ought to be in the mountains of South Carolina. And I said, well, what kind of places are they finding them on? He said, well, granitic outcroppings that have a view, and sometimes boulder fields out in the woods. I'm glad I didn't do something, Pam. And he said, is there anything like that up where you live? And I said, well, I live in front of the biggest granitic dome in South Carolina, Table Rock Mountain. If you've ever ridden down the Cherokee Foothill Scenic Highway, we live just beyond Table Rock. And the mountain next to it, Pinnacle Mountain, has a lot of rock outcroppings too. I said, you come up to the house, and if there's anything up there like that, we'll find it. Now, this part's going to sound like I made it up, but Jane will tell you it's absolutely true. He drives up from Columbia. We leave out from our house walking. It took 2.5 hours to get up on Pinnacle Mountain. We found 600 the first day. All on one outcropping. It's like lines of text in a page, and you're going to see in just a few minutes. That was in 1999. And the rest of the slideshow is really the story of what evolved after that. You can imagine, I'll never forget that first day because Tommy is a consummate professional. And he said, Dennis, I want you to look at these things again and see if this could possibly be some kind of natural phenomenon. He said, if I go public with this and I tell the world we have found 600 petroglyphs and that was our estimate. It turns out we've since hired another archaeologist, a contract archaeologist from Atlanta, to come up and study that particular site. There's actually 1,043. So that was just our estimate. So anyway, Tommy says if we go public with this, and this turns out some geologist comes up here and says, oh, that's an erosional kind of thing and everything. He says, my career's ruined. I said, well, I'll tell the world that, that we've discovered them. I don't have a reputation to lose. So anyway, we did go public. It got quite a bit of press coverage. As a matter of fact, front page above the fold in the Greenville News. And I remember there was a photograph of me standing up on this high ridge and everything, and it got people's attention, and reports started coming in of petroglyphs all across the Piedmont and the mountain segments. And I'll just make a very long story short that is still playing out. We now know these are they're all circle themed petroglyphs up on these. They're all above 2,000 feet. They're nearly homogeneous in that they're all circle themed. There are no footprints and turkey tracks and lots of other things that you find, say, at Petroglyph National Monument out in New Mexico. We now know that we have over 2,000 of them on 15 different sites in both Carolinas. Yeah.
Who owns that property?
It's all state-owned property now, thank goodness. It's owned by the Department of Natural Resources. It's part of, if you've ever heard of Jocassee Gorges, 35,000 acre, it's really, well, it's well within the property. There's no danger of encroachment up there, thank goodness. As a matter of fact, 3 of the sites, almost all of them are on publicly owned land. You're probably familiar with DuPont State Forest up in Cedar Mountain? There are 3 outcroppings there that have the circles, 2 in Pisgah National Forest, 1 on John Rock and 1 on Cedar Rock Mountain, which I'm not familiar with, but I'll show you here in a few minutes. So let's get started. This is Table Rock. Right here, this is the side you see from Highway 11. And I'm going to point out a couple features here. This is the Stool Mountain. There is, in fact, a Cherokee legend. The Cherokees had 2 types of characters in their mythology, either little people who were like little leprechauns and they created mischief, and children could talk to them and see them and communicate with them, but the adults couldn't see them, and giants. Junaluska was supposed to be a giant. Juticula, if you've ever been to Juticula Rock up near Western Carolina University, they are supposed to be the scratchings from Juticula having walked around the landscape and scratched up the rock there. And they had a legend that a giant chieftain ate his meals on Table Rock and sat on the Stool Mountain. Okay, so there's that. The reason I'm pointing out these landmarks I'm going to show you, had a rare opportunity to fly in a small airplane around this area and took some photographs, which is the bulk of the slideshow. And I was talking about this whole concept of petroglyphs in South Carolina got a lot of press attention. After a little while, a graduate student, maybe 2 months had expired since a lot of press coverage, and a graduate student called Tommy Charles and he said, I'm doing you see that little band of rock right there, that outcropping? He did his entire master's thesis on that rock outcropping, which is, I didn't know you could do that, get a master's thesis and study one rock outcropping. But he did, and he said while he was gouging around and exploring the area to see the limits of the outcropping itself, he got up here on the top of the stool and found a rock shelter, a cave, and a pretty nice one. And inside of it, I'm going to show you in just a minute, but inside of it was a pictograph, a cave painting, and it's a sunburst, a sun with 7 rays. 7 was a magic number among the Cherokees, and at the end of each of the 7 rays was a figure that represented the 7 clans of the Cherokees. So the story just keeps getting better. By the way, this is my grandmother's. This is Highway 11, the Cherokee Foothills Scenic Highway. This is probably the most photographed natural feature in South Carolina. As a matter of fact, when Jane and I were on the way up here this morning, there was already somebody parked there taking a photograph, and that was about 7:30 this morning. Just another view, kind of a ground level view. You can see how prominent the stool is in relation to Table Rock. I want you to pay attention to this section right here. These are the circle petroglyphs. that I'm talking about. I just want you to see what I'm talking about, a little closer view. That's a configuration that everybody swears looks like a tiger paw. As a matter of fact, I had a group up there. I take a group every fall, just one group a year, from Clemson's OLLI program, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And there was a lady in that particular group that had a bright orange Clemson sweatshirt with a white tiger paw on it. And she laid down beside that thing. Somebody took her picture and they made a poster out of it, and it's in dorm rooms. Now, they don't have a clue what it is and all that, but anyway, now you know what a circle petroglyph looks like. It literally looks like somebody cut a donut out of the rock and left a central pedestal, which would be where the donut hole was. So now that you know what circle petroglyphs are, this is what you were looking at. You can see the bottom of the wing here. This is the 740-foot sheer cliff. Obviously, there are no petroglyphs there, but to the right, where I was directing your attention a while ago, from here to here, believe it or not, in the 1840s, there was a set of steps that went up Table Rock, and it was an attraction. 1840s, a lot of southern planters from coastal South Carolina would try to escape what was called the sickly season during the summer and fall. And Flat Rock, North Carolina, Cashers, Highlands, even the city of Greenville, these were Pendleton, South Carolina, were all summer resorts for Charleston planters. And so there was a fellow, William Sutherland, who built the Table Rock Hotel. It was a big grand hotel and had a dance hall and all this kind of stuff. And one of the features was he'd hired this guy to build a set of steps up through here, and he would take you in a goat cart up to the Stool Gap. The stool that you saw would be right here, and this is the Stool Gap, and that's as far as you can go, and you had to walk your way up to there and then climb the stairs. And I have the diaries of 4 different ladies who made the trip in the 1840s. Most of them had summer homes in Pendleton or Greenville, so it was a day trip for them. And they're quite dramatic and very florid language about well, some of them would get the vapors and have to be carried off of the mountain. But it was quite the thing, and so people were coming from all over to see this. Now, I mentioned all of that because in 2 of those 4 journals, they say the same thing. They hired a guide, a local guide, to take them up there, and he told them when the steps ended, which would be this area right here, there were elephant tracks in the rock. That was the story they were told. And the story is that when the earth was young and the rocks were still clay, that elephants, mastodons, I guess, walked the earth, and that's the circle. Well, it turns out those are our circle petroglyphs. They range from, you saw quite a range there. They're from as small as about a chicken egg up to volleyball size, really. So we have actually hired a drone to go up there and photograph those. There's about 20 or 30, yeah.
What happened to the steps?
Really, the Civil War. When the Civil War came along, the tourist traffic just dried up, and within a year or 2, the hotel went out of business as a resort hotel. It was maintained as a home for a long time. The steps were made out of locust, and they were, I'm going to show you in just a minute, they weren't continuous. They built them in sections, and they pinned them to the rock with these iron pins. And an editor, I don't want to tell too many side stories because Jane's the timekeeper here and she'll shut me off here in about 50 minutes. But this is a good one. Glenn Olin, who was the managing editor of the Wildlife magazine, when I first started writing for him in 1989, we became good friends. He's now a senior editor at National Geographic. And Glenn called me, just like Tommy Charles, the archaeologist. Glenn called me one day and he said, "Dennis, I'm sitting here reading." He had one of these diary articles, the entries that I had read later on. And he said, "I'm reading a first-hand personal account of somebody who climbed a set of steps that went up Table Rock in the 1840s. I said, "Glenn, I've been living here all my life. It's not physically possible to put a set of steps." He said, "Well, nevertheless, I'm reading about it." And I said, "Well, why don't you come up here to the house? Let's go up there and look." So we did. Took about a half a day. We got to this point right here. And the plan was, I originally wanted to go to the right side there and we'd just work our way back across the face, because I told him, I said, look, if there were indeed steps that went up Table Rock, they had to have them pinned down with something or they wouldn't survive the first storm, you know. So we'll look for that. So we get up there, and that's the rock shelter with the pictograph. I'll just go ahead and show you these now. This is the pictograph I was talking about. You can see each of the 7 rays. There's the deer clan, the bird clan, arrow clan, the man clan. That's kind of a stylized, you see that in petroglyphs actually, rock carvings, that same stylized with a kind of uplifted arms there thing. And, bird clan, 3-toed bird there. But anyway, that's inside that rock shelter. At that time, when that graduate student found that one, and you can see we brought a gaggle of geologists and archaeologists and everybody up there. You can also tell it's August and everybody's soaking sweat. It's a hard 2-hour climb to get up there. But I don't know a whole lot about geology. I know about enough to be dangerous. But I asked one of the Furman University geologists on that trip, I said, what would they have done this with? Because it looked like sidewalk chalk to me. And he said, yellow ochre. He said, there's red ochre and there's yellow ochre. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, when you're riding down the road sometime down in the Piedmont section of South Carolina and North Carolina, and it's a red bank on the road, and you hit a patch that looks like it's red clay that has turned to rock, but you could break it with your hand. He said, that's red ochre. And I said, well, would they find something like that up here at this elevation? Because it's up around just under 3,000 feet. He said, oh, no, this would be down in the, in the floodplain areas down there. And I said, so they would have had to bring this yellow ochre with them. And he said, yeah, they'd had to bring it somewhere. And I was thinking to myself, well, they wouldn't go to the trouble to take it back. I'll bet it's right there. So they're off over here, and Tommy Charles was on this trip. They were talking archaeology and all this kind of stuff. Now, I went and got a rock, which wasn't hard to find because there's a lot of them scaled off the roof of the rock shelter, made a great digging tool. I went straight down the wall to the ground, dug down about 6 inches, and I found that piece of yellow ochre. It was buried under about 6 inches of kind of sandy effluent or stuff that had come in from the sides and filled in there, and it's on our coffee table today. So it's the real deal. As a matter of fact, I went outside the rock shelter because I didn't want to deface, the wall that had that on it, but I went outside just to make sure that what I had in my hand produced the same color in it. Well, that's it. So I got the right thing. Okay, now back to our steps story right here. So I'll tell Glenn Owen to come up there, and we're gonna go look for this thing. And so we get to this point right here, and I got my walking stick, and we brought us a little snack, some cookies and stuff. And I said, okay, we had a 2.5 hour pretty serious hike. I said, let's stop here and eat our cookies, and then we'll kind of divide up and work our way along the face of this thing, because there's going to be some points where somebody has to go this way and go that way, where rocks have fallen off over the years. And so this is a different view of it, but the steps went right up through there, and we are right here. And I'm looking around, and I said, well, if I lay my walking stick down, it's going to fall off into the Table Rock Reservoir. And I saw these 2 square holes, and I said, well, that probably wouldn't work. And then I found a round hole right there, and I said, well, that'd be perfect. And I said, wait a minute. A round hole I can understand. Why are there 2 square holes up here on this steep slope of the mountain? So I went and stood. You can see Table Rock Reservoir right there. By the way, it is the face I originally showed you, the face of Table Rock, the due south face that you see from Highway 11, it has a 740-foot cliff. The north side, which you'll see in just a minute, is 1,000 foot. So you can imagine why the Charleston ladies got the vapors. When you're going up these steps, you're actually looking 1,000 feet down to the ground. But you know what they say, it's not the fall that kills you, it's the abrupt stop at the bottom. So anyway, I go and I stand there where the stairs are, and I look up slope, and lo and behold, there's one of the iron pins right there from the 1840s. So it's the real deal. just a final view of just how dramatic. Now you're starting to see that 1,000-foot sheer cliff. Now, believe it or not, later on we found this section right here of the dramatic north face, that would be back over here. There's about 250 of the circles. Now that's a football field sized, really good carving rock, smooth, worn from age. They are all in one band, about 4 feet wide down through there. Go figure. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't do this now on a bet. But I was up there by myself one time. That's my camouflage cap and walking stick and something else. And I'm out there on the cleft of that 1,000-foot drop. Like I say, I wouldn't do that again. I was 10 foot tall and bulletproof back then. But
Is this limestone or?
no, this is what's called table rock gneiss. It actually has its own classification. It's granitic gneiss. In other words, it's a form, an imperfect form of granite. Gneiss is, and really the only thing from blue granite is South Carolina State stone, and a quarry, for example, down in Winsboro, South Carolina, is strictly blue granite. It's very uniform. You see it in countertops a lot because it has no imperfections and stuff. Granitic gneiss is not quite as hard as blue granite and has bands of feldspar and quartz, kind of wavy. It's metamorphic rock formed under a lot of pressure.
And the circles are hypothesized as representations of the sun?
Boy, I tell you, there are lots of theories, and yours is as good as anybody else's. I initially came up, Tommy and I made several trips after that, and we would ponder, because we know, and it turns out to be true, that the two things everybody wants to know is who made them and what do they mean. Now, we don't know the answer to either one of those, but I do have a couple educated guesses. I came up with a theory that, I don't care how primitive a culture is, and these, I'll tell you why I know this to be true, but they predate the Cherokees. So that gets you back 1,000 years. There's not a lot of things that archaeologists agree on, but archaeologists agree throughout the Southeast, agree that the Cherokees have been in this region for about 1,000 years. Now that's 500 years of documented history when DeSoto came through in 1540, and then 500 years when they were probably more like hunter-gatherers than, cultivating the alluvial floodplains and living seasonally in villages and stuff like that. So I'm almost certain that these petroglyphs predate the Cherokees, which gets you back older than 1,000 years, which I'll tell you why, because of the wearing pattern. When we get to the Long Ridge site that Tommy and I found that day, I'll tell you why I think they may have been laid down over as much as 1,000-year period. I know that's a pretty dramatic, this is a little better close-up of what you're looking at. Here's one of the, see that prominent little pedestal there, and that's right there on the cleft of the outcropping. Now, every time I have been on top of Table Rock, particularly right there in that section, you're looking off into what is called the Table Rock Watershed. This is the watershed for the Table Rock Reservoir, which is one of 3 water sources for the city of Greenville. And they have owned that property since 1920s when they bought it. And of course, there's no access by anybody. It takes an act of Congress to get permission to go in there just to study some wildflower or a rare bat or something like this. It's almost impossible to get permission in there. Well, every time I have stood on top of Table Rock, knowing what I know now, that there's nearly 2,000 of them on 15 different sites, I told Tommy one time, I said, Tommy, they've carved on every place you can carve on Table Rock, 5 different outcroppings. They got to be on this outcropping. Look, this is huge. This has got to be 4 acres. This is a waterfall here, Slicking Falls waterfall. They've got to be on that outcropping, but what would it take? It is not worth what it takes to try to get permission to go in there. We're having success in other areas. Let's just keep going. I said, okay. So this went on for years. I finally got to know one of the commissioners by accident with the Greenville Watershed. Well, I told him what I just told you, and he said, well, let's go look. I said, okay, you don't have to ask me twice. So within a week or so of him saying that, we arranged a day. He's an attorney in Greenville, and he took a day off and got the staff up there, had us a Rhino four-wheel drive vehicle. Still took us an hour and 40 minutes to get to the point where this is the closest we could get with the Rhinos, an old road through here, an old toll road from the 1800s. We parked right here and literally had to crawl on our hands and knees through this ivy thicket here and came across through here. Now here's the punchline of the story. We found 250 circles. This is an aerial view of it. This is the waterfall and this is the outcropping right here. Just to show you how dramatic that north side is, and that's taken from the reservoir. This is the guys that were on us with the field. This is Jim Bannister, the commissioner here. That's what Table Rock looks like from the north side, and they're standing at the waterfall. Those petroglyphs I showed you are right in this area here, steps right here. This is Jim. He actually found the first ones. He just happened to, be the first one up on the face of the rock. You can see he found a cluster of about 20 there, and we estimated about 250. This rock outcropping is characterized by these deeply eroded, I call them gullies, in the rock. Now you can imagine this is granitic gneiss. How long it takes to wear a gully. Some of these are this deep if you look at the surrounding rock. All of the petroglyphs are on these ridges. This is another gully over here just like this one. There are none down in this area. They're all up on these ridges, which raises the question, were there petroglyphs originally there and they got eroded away, or did the Native Americans who carved them say, well, I'm not going to carve them there, they'll get washed away? I don't know. Anyway, this is kind of an overview. This is not all the sites, but this is Long Ridge that I'm going to show you in a minute. This is where Tommy and I went the first time. I later found this Rachel Creek outcropping here is visible from Highway 11. It looks straight up and down, but it's actually at such an angle. Before I was looking for petroglyphs, I had been out on it quite a number of times. There's about 30 or 40 there. Drawbar Cliffs and the Parlier site are two different sites. On Drawbar Cliffs, I would say there's 120 to 150, and this is interesting. I'll have to introduce you to a term that my wife Jane uses pretty regularly, the jelly legs. When you get the jelly legs, when you just feel like, oh God, I can't go out there on that ledge. You get the jelly legs. I don't care how much time you spend crawling around rocks and this kind of stuff. You get the jelly legs just going out there to look where these things are, and they're carved on a section that there's nothing to hold on to. It's on a sheer face that just kind of has a little cleft. So anyway, this is an aerial view of just about everything I've talked about. This is the Rachel Creek outcropping that you see from Highway 11. This is Bald Knob. There's only, surprisingly, even though that's a prominent feature, there's only one that we could find there, and it's a sunburst. It's just like that cave painting. It's a sun, and they're clear rays. It's not 7, it's 4, I think. And this is, I tell people when Tommy and I were thinking about, why would Native Americans be up here? These are very thin soils. A lot of things are growing on rock, on 2 or 3 inches of soil. It's not the kind of place that would be a good place to hunt. It's above 3,000 feet in most cases. It takes considerable effort to get up there. In some cases, there's not water within a quarter mile. So we think they came up there with express purpose, like a Mecca or a pilgrimage, to go up on high and get these tremendous views and pick these things out. But this is the big ridge line. But I told Tommy, I said, really, having done it a number of times, when you're walking between Long Ridge, where the petroglyphs are, out toward Table Rock, it's a dead-end street. It doesn't go to Virginia. It don't even go to Punkintown, which is only 6 miles away. It's just, you had to have a reason to continue on this ridge line. It's up and down, and it's rough terrain, and it's rough going. You got to have a reason to go out there. Whereas the archaeologist I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes, who has done this more recent research, and he is considered the Southeast expert on rock art in general. That's his thing. And he says that he has found most of the major petroglyph sites obviously meaning Atlanta. He's done a lot of work in northeastern Georgia, near old ancient Indian trails. And you remember I told you the one there on Slicking Falls was adjacent to this old toll road that I can document was there in 1840s and probably before. And next to the Long Ridge site, as the crow flies, just a tenth of a mile away, is the old Buncombe Trail that crossed over the Eastern Continental Divide and into the French Broad drainage, which Native Americans follow any stream in the French Broad drainage and end up in New Orleans. If they stayed on it long enough, that's actually the route that's how DeSoto found the Mississippi, where he died. But the point of this is, it's obvious they came up here for that particular reason, to carve these things out. That's Highway 11, just to put things in perspective. This is Caesar's Head right here, and this area we're in today would be right in this direction up in there. That's Ball Knob that I was talking about, which is a prominent outcropping. This is actually the literal topographic peak of Pinnacle, the second tallest mountain in South Carolina. I think it's 3,400 and some odd feet, but just another view of Ball Knob. This is Drawbar Cliffs that I was telling you about. You can see it's pretty dramatic. Most of this is sheer vertical cliff. The petroglyphs are right here in this section right there. And 120 is quite a concentration of them. This is the Rachel Creek outcropping from the air. There's actually two outcroppings here. Both of them have circle petroglyphs on them. Now this brings us to the original site where Tommy and I found 600 the first day. This is Long Ridge, which is a ridge coming off of Pinnacle. It's very prominent if you're riding down Highway 11 and you just visually look at what I just showed you, the Ball Knob and then the top of Pinnacle Mountain. This is a very prominent ridge coming off and running parallel to Highway 11, or the Cherokee Foothill Scenic Highway. This section you're looking at from this point to this point is solid rock. The whole top of the mountain is in solid rock. We found about 20 on this fairly large section, and they were much more degraded than the ones we eventually found right up in here, which I'll show you in a minute, the main petroglyph site. More highly degraded because in the 1950s, the logging road that led you up here was actually open to public traffic, and people were driving Jeeps up there and doing things they probably shouldn't do. And the only reason I wasn't doing it, I actually grew up in Greenville County and I didn't know about it. We had our place, we had Parish Mountain, but anyway, there were a lot of people up there and it really degraded these. But they were the first ones we actually saw. This is another view of Drawbar Cliffs right here. And again, the petroglyphs are right there on that, a place where you can walk. This is it. And I know it doesn't look like much, but from the air, this is actually a drone photo that, all right, I have to stop just a minute to tell you about this, which is the most recent, the only archaeological study, and I know you can't see detail, that's okay. This is my photograph, so you're going to see that photograph here in a minute. We hired a fellow, all right, along the way, not initially, but we met this fellow. He became kind of under the umbrella of circle petroglyph hunters that were, a group of people who really got caught up in this phenomenon and were looking all over the upstate and finding petroglyphs. And they're in this area, I'm sure. Tommy Charles famously said early on, he said, "We don't find what we don't look for." And people took that message to heart, that they could be in your backyard. If you know of a rock outcropping, take a look at it. Go out and look. They may be there, and in many cases they were. So this fellow Gene Johnston kind of got really seriously in, and he's a retired Type A engineer. Type A in the sense that he never has enough to do. So whatever it is, he does with all of his being. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, whatever it is. So he's actually got a few petroglyphs to his credit, but the main thing is he always comes to me, what's the next step? What do we do now? And I said, what we really need to do, we've gotten a lot of publicity and we're finding a lot of petroglyphs. This is great, but they need interpretation. We're amateurs And there's a limit on what you can tell the public and what you can interpret about petroglyphs, because there's no carbon. You can't actually date them. It's not like a village site that you found or something like this. I said, but we need a bona fide, certified archaeologist to come up here and study these petroglyphs, and if nothing else, map them, get them recorded. They're going to deteriorate over time. And so he gets on the internet. First of all, he hires a drone pilot to go up there and take this photograph and a few more all the way down to hovering right over the rock. He sends it to archaeologists literally all over the world, and he gets a lot of really positive response, as in, I've been doing this for 30 years and I've never seen anything like this. The universal comment was, I have never seen a site in the world with this many petroglyphs of the same motif. Now you go in the American Southwest and Australia and South Africa and other places, you'll find concentrations of lots of petroglyphs, but it's geometric designs and it's animal prints and it's sometimes a human hand, all these different things. These are all about circles. So to have that many petroglyphs on 15 different sites that we know of right now in 2 states, all of the same motif, is an incredible phenomenon. There's this one fellow, Robert Bednarik, in Australia, who was particularly impressed with this, and we're still corresponding with him, and he assures us next time he gets on the North American continent, he's going to Long Ridge. He has sent us everything he thinks is pertinent in the way of what this means and how this happened, and he's perfecting a technique he calls crystal photography. He's trying to develop a method to age petroglyphs based on microphotography of the crystalline structure, and it would appear worn being exposed to the elements. So anyway, there's that. So then Gene Johnston gets all this interest from archaeologists, and he comes back to me and he said, okay, what's next? And I said, well, Gene, we're just 2 guys. I said, but we got to raise some money and we need to hire an archaeologist to come up here and study these things. He said, okay. One of the fellows who had responded was a Dr. Johnanes Loubser from South Africa, who is in Atlanta. He's a contract archaeologist. He's the one I was talking about, is a southeastern rock art expert. Gene checks out his resume and everything. Oh yeah, he's the real deal. He's the guy. So Gene contacts him and says, okay, we want you to come up here and spend a week. How much would it cost? He generates a proposal, based on the terrain. It takes a lot to get men and material up at 3,000 feet in this remote location and all this. He said, about $10,000. I said, Gene, ask him about 5 days. see, $10,000 is a lot of money. And I wrote in an article that I wrote later on, I said, we didn't have $10,000, we didn't have $10. And so he comes back, he said, okay, look, I'm really interested in this phenomenon. This is who we now know as Johnanes Loubser, Johnny. And Johnny writes back and he says, I'm really caught up in this phenomenon. I want to see it, first of all, and I consider it an honor that you all asked me to do it. He said, how about $7,500 for 5 days, and I will produce a report. So, again, we don't have $7,500, we don't have $75. Okay, so I have already discovered the 250 new petroglyphs that I showed you on the Greenville Watershed property. So I did a little slideshow presentation, went down and talked to the board, and they are greatly impressed that they have this resource because they're in Greenville. They've been reading these articles for years about the petroglyphs we're finding and all this. And they now have on their property the 2nd most densely carved outcropping known. So they donate $5,000, and then Gene arranges for a private donation for the additional $2,500. And let me tell you something, we got $10,000 worth of work. This is an incredible document, wonderful photography. Yanni in his office traced out with some kind of software program that allows him to take like a black felt marker and mark around every one of them, which really puts them in dramatic relief and gives you a sense of just how many of them. And he broke down every petroglyph of any size into about 12 different categories. I know, I hate that you can't see detail here, but you can see this is how they're distributed on the rock outcropping. You see those black dots, just assume every one of those is a circle petroglyph, you know. They're all clustered down there in one little corner. He was up here again as recently as 2 weeks ago because when he did the initial 5-day research project, are you telling me 50 minutes? Okay, false alarm.
Go backwards while you roll.
Yeah, I noticed that. We'll get back to the petroglyph site. He had a couple volunteer drone pilots to come up with him when he did that initial research. A couple years ago, they just volunteered because they're friends of his. They're professional drone pilots. And they came up and, you know, went up 50 meters and then down 25 and all this. And Janie and I were up there that day. It was the most brutal conditions. It was in February. 28 degrees and a 30-mile-an-hour wind. Now, 30-mile-an-hour wind is gale force wind. And we got two $10,000 drones up there buzzing around like two bumblebees. And they're in danger of crashing. And finally, the guy just says, this is it. I can't risk my equipment anymore. And they had a pretty good segment that they had not photographed. They said, we're just going to have to do this later. So a couple weeks ago, the drone pilots came back up. Yanni, he spent 3 more days up here. And I know this story gets better at every step, but this is incredible. I was not able to go because Jane and I were moving into our newly renovated home and everything was crazy and I had 100 things to do. I just couldn't go up there. That evening, Yanni calls and says, you're not going to believe this. He said, when we got up there was a historic fire a few years ago that burned for a month. I'm sure y'all read all about it. You may have smelled the smoke. As a matter of fact, I helped fight the fire, and that's where that scar came from right there, and I'll tell you that story some other time. But anyway, when he got up there, you're probably familiar if you go out on any rock outcroppings, south-facing rock outcroppings, they're what people call moss mats. Moss mat. They're pretty dense, pretty high, and it takes like 100 years for these things to develop on a site, and they're barely clinging onto the rock and everything. Well, the fire killed those. And the rains that we have had recently had washed them off. And they found, he estimates he said he wouldn't be able to have a count on them until he got back to his office. He said somewhere between 100 and 150. So it just keeps growing, you know. We estimated 600, turns out it's 1,040, and now Yanni's found 100, 150 more. This is the view you get from the rock outcropping where the petroglyphs are. That's looking west toward Lake Jocassee and Lake Kiowee. As a matter of fact, they would be visible except for the vegetation on these mountains here. This is kind of the slope that it is. It's relatively steep, but you don't really get the jelly legs. It's not that kind of steep. That fellow, a good friend of mine, was the state archaeologist at that time with the Department of Natural Resources. Another shot of the Clemson tiger. Yeah, there she is. That was that lady's hat that day. So not only she had the sweatshirt on, but she had the hat to go with it too. This is the photograph that's on the cover of the thing. You can see how densely carved they are here. Now, I guess this is a good time to tell you, I mentioned a little earlier that at least this is the world according to Dennis Chastain. This is my theory. Tommy and I were probably on our 3rd trip up there just to kind of, we had decided one time we really needed to, we were telling people 600, but we really ought to at least make a good faith effort to count them. So we'd taken a piece of chalk up there and we had a plan. I was going to do the counting and Tommy would mark a mark on one, you know, with the chalk every time I counted one. Well, we didn't get but about 6 by 4 feet, and we already had 125. And I said, Tommy, this is going to take the rest of the morning. I got something else I want to show you. We were also exploring rock shelters for pictographs and this kind of stuff. I said, look, there's a minimum of 600. Wouldn't you agree, just based on what we've... He said, oh, yeah, minimum. I would feel comfortable doing that. And as you know, it turned out there was over 1,000. But anyway, that same trip, I happened to be at the bottom of the rock outcropping because it was convenient for me because I was doing the counting and he was doing the marking. And I noticed something that everybody else now that I pointed out sees it. If you look at them from left to right, and this is sort of the end of them right here with that little erosional gully, and they go off to the right. If you look at them from the left to the right, they are more deeply incised into the rock. The edges are sharper and more clearly defined. In other words, they look cleaner and newer, fresher, to the point that when you get to the far right, 100 feet away, they are almost level with the surface of the rock, to the point that if you go out there on a bright sunny day, you can't see them. Even if you know where they are, you can't find them in a bright sunny day because it bleaches everything out. Now, think about that. We were talking earlier about granitic gneiss and how slowly it wears. It wears down in geologic time. How much time between when the ones on the left were carved in the rock and when the ones on the right would have to pass for there to be such a differential in terms of the depth, the sharpness of the features and all that? I told Tommy, I said, it is not unreasonable to think that they were laid down over a period of hundreds of years and maybe 1,000 years. Just depending, okay, it's hard to tell the wear rate because it depends on the pitch of the soil, and this is one of the highest rainfall areas. Pam and I were talking about this earlier. This area around Table Rock and Rocky Bottom has, since the 1800s, had the highest rainfall in the entire state. So all of these factors go into the equation. There's the next section there, and then they just keep going. There they are. That's the picture I tried to show you a while ago. I'm glad I'd forgotten I had a slide on it, but it shows you. This is the arc right here that they did a couple weeks ago, and you see these moss mats right here? These are the ones that are now gone. All of these, and these. So that's where they found the additional 100 or 150. This is the fire that occurred a few years ago. And by the way, I will tell you, even though Jane's called time on me, I'm sure you want to know where my dolphin-shaped scar came from. I had been on the mountain firefighting team for about 7, 8 years before the fire, but had kind of retired and resigned. And so I knew a lot of people with the Forestry Commission, and the state forester is a good friend of mine. So when the fire broke out, this is the Petroglyph site right here. That's Ball Knob on Pinnacle. It started at a campsite right there on the Foothills Trail. And so they needed to get a hand crew on top of Table Rock. Hand crew meaning just rake the leaves away and build a fire line. You can't get a heavy equipment up there. And then take a bulldozer, a regular Forestry Commission bulldozer from the Highway 11 side and go up there and meet the hand crew. But nobody knew how to get up there. So they called me. And I said, yeah, sure, I can mentally right now figure out a route I know where the hand line's going to be, where we can meet them. And so I go up there, and I'm on my four-wheeler, and the terrain, honestly, is just nearly vertical. The higher you get, the steeper it gets. And I'm behind the bulldozer, talking on a radio, telling, turn left, turn right. And I'm watching him and watching my four-wheeler, because if you go over a rock that raises you up when you're on that kind of slope, you go over backwards. So you have about 12 things you're watching, and I noticed the bulldozer clips a muscadine vine, which goes 120 feet up in the tree. And if you ever noticed, all the foliage is at the top where it's attached to the tree, and the rest of it's like a big rope. Well, 120 feet of muscadine vine probably weighs 60 or 80 pounds. He clips the bottom of this thing and it pulls it out of the tree, and I look up and it's going to hit me right about there. So I got to hold my brakes to keep from going down backwards, and I throw my left hand up there. Well, it comes, and as my friend with the Forestry Commission said, he looked at it, he said, it peeled the bark right off of it, didn't it? This was originally about that wide. And I thought, if I go to a doctor, they're going to do a skin graft, which means I'm going to have, if your goal is to get an infection, check yourself into the nearest hospital, and it's a guaranteed, surefire thing. So I've had a policy now for over 50 years. Do not go to a doctor's office or a hospital unless there's an emergency. You absolutely have to do it. So I happened to run up on a surgeon friend of mine. I was doing a slideshow, actually. It may have been this one. And Stuart Bachnight, and I asked Stuart, it was fresh. This had just happened about 2 days earlier. I said, Stuart, what do you think I ought to do? He said, not a damn thing. Don't do anything. He said, keep it dry. Don't put any kind of ointments or anything on it. Leave it exposed to the air, and it will pull itself back together. And that's what I did. And it is, you know, I just got that after that big gaping wound. Everybody would have said, oh, God, you got to go do this and this and this. Okay, so this is a fire. Now, I told you about the petroglyphs Johnanes Loubser found a couple weeks ago. Right after the fire, we had to go up there, and we got to get permission from DNR every time we go up there and everything. I can't remember exactly what it was. We went up there and we found that the fire had killed all of the Virginia pines around the fringe of the rock outcropping. I'm not going to back up to show you, but the entire rock outcropping, Virginia pine is a pioneering species, and it can live in as little as 2 inches of litter, forest litter out on the rock. It's an incredible plant, really. And they had all been killed by the fire. So one of our circle hunters, Michael Bramlett from Seneca, he got permission from the DNR to push a couple of these things over. They're just got a little root wad, and they're growing right on the rock, so you can just literally push them over after they're dead. This is just one. This is what was under one of those Virginia pines. All told, you can see how bright. Do you notice that rock that I showed you earlier, the main has a kind of a darkish patina to it that develops over time? You can see this has not been exposed for however old those trees are, and there are circle petroglyphs all under there. So that's an additional 250 was the count on that. And he filled some of them with sand, which is, nobody had ever tried that before. According to Johnanes Loubser, he'd never seen it done, but you know what? It does really show you, you know, these are linked together kind of like in a chain. And it really gives you a little different perspective. You can see the donut hole here, the little pedestal in the middle. That figure 8 configuration, and this is Johnanes' tracing that he did. That's those lines, those vertical lines that you saw in the rock. And this is the cover here. This is his breakdown of, you know, I call them circles or circle-themed petroglyphs. This is just the true circles. These are more circular, it says circle with meander, which means they have a line extending off of them. And you get down to something that looks like a figure 8, or the symbol for infinity. If you remember your trigonometry class, to other miscellaneous circle-themed petroglyphs. But all this is useful information. This is Gene Johnston that I was talking about. This is Johnanes Loubser, and this is one of the drone pilots. You can tell how frigid it was there that day. It was brutal. But gosh, what a tremendous resource to have. That drone photography with all these things highlighted on there for the ages. I think people, a generation of archaeologists will be studying this, and this is Tommy Charles that I've talked about. We had SCETV out there one time with a film crew. I think the most thing I learned that day was, you know when they roll the credits on a movie and it says gaff? I've always wondered, what is a gaff? Well, these two 20-something guys are the gaffs, and it turns out one of them does the camera and one of them holds the stick that's got the microphone on it. Well, that's what a gaff does. This is the state archaeologist up here, and this couple, Tom and Bev Parlier, are volunteers. They kind of got caught up in this circle petroglyph phenomenon. They found all 3 of the sites in DuPont State Forest, the one I mentioned on John Rock and the one on Cedar Rock. And you may have noticed when I was running through, remember I had that map with the different sites? One of them is called the Parlier site. They found one not that far from the main site. And that's one of the Ollie groups that I took up there. This gets into a different category, and I think our time's up. So since I've got the slide up, I know you're intrigued by it. I will tell you what this one is. It's called one of 2 things. Some people call it a line and circle carving, and others call it a tar burner rock. The reason for that is tar, I wrote an article in South Carolina Wildlife Magazine on tar, pine, pitch, tar, and turpentine industry down along the coast of South Carolina from the colonial period up to 1930s. Before that came about, local folks, whether it was down along the coast, tar had such I know the USD one time found 30 different uses for tar, pitch, and turpentine. You can coat ropes in it and they become waterproof. You can seal up ships. The reason they're called naval stores, a ship was made with wooden planks. Well, what's the first thing happens when you put a wooden plank ship out on the ocean? It starts hitting waves and going up and down, and the plank affects, and it leaks and you sink. But you could take what's called oakum, and that is a fiber rope coated in tar, saturated with tar. They had a tool to pack it into, like, basically caulking the joints of those planks, and it don't matter how rough it gets. It's going to seal it up as the ship flexes. So there's that. You could grease axle wheels with it. Well, small scale production had been going on since the very early colonial period along the eastern seaboard because it had so many uses. And what they would do is they would either find a rock like this, which Tommy Charles is convinced was a prehistoric motif. He says that because he has found them as small as 2 or 3 inches across with that motif on a vertical rock. Well, you can't make tar on a vertical rock. It has to be a relatively flat surface. This is a large one that was found on top of Paris Mountain. This fellow building a house up there. The bulldozer operator, when the rock flipped over, saw this. You can actually see the tar residue here on this. What they would do is put an iron kettle, a pot or something, or build a mud dome over it. Same technology that they use down on the coast is called a tar kiln. You just use, it's just a larger scale version. They take rosin-rich pine, longleaf pine down in the coast, which is just full oozing with rosin, and not burn it, but you basically is heating it up. You light a little fire, but it's a controlled environment. They would punch a small hole at the top at first, just a little oxygen in it. You're sweating it out with a slow smoldering fire. And so by putting a pot over it, they'd seal the bottom up, set some kindling on fire, and it would sweat out the rosin. It would collect in this, obviously like the veins of a leaf, and come down here to the edge of rock, and you catch it in some kind of vessel. So there's a whole category of these called line and circle or tar-bearded rocks. When Tommy and I first started looking for petroglyphs, there were 46 of these in the entire eastern seaboard. That would be from Georgia, because there are no petroglyphs in Florida. There are no rock outcroppings in Florida. It's former seabed. So anyway, you don't find petroglyphs below the fall line in South Carolina, because about 10,000 years ago the ocean was about where Columbia is now, so there are no granitic outcropping. So anyway, along the entire eastern seaboard, from Georgia to Maine, there were 46 known line and circle petroglyphs. Tommy has since found 48 just in South Carolina. So we're becoming the petroglyph capital of the Southeast.